Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I'm a military historian. And unfortunately, like a lot of you guys, I've been watching the events unfolding up in Minnesota, especially the use of violence by federal agents against protesters and people that they've taken into custody. I've also seen a lot of commentators and viewers like you compare what is happening there as being akin to what happened in 1930s Nazi Germany. Therefore, I'm going to give you a kind of insight into my thinking about this as a historian and also draw the appropriate parallels to the past. Um, as regular viewers are aware, and I always mention this at the beginning of my videos, I'm a military historian, specifically a naval historian, and I have both my bachelor's degree and master's degree in history. The main period of my studies has pretty much for the last 25, 30 years, and also my ongoing research is centered on the early 20th century with a focus on the world wars, namely just strategic thinking and war planning that occurred, especially right before the First World War. That is where my studies are focused at this time. I've also attended courses that focused in detail on the history of Germany and Russia during that era. In fact, my uh, one of my capstone papers was on the Russian Civil War, which occurred between 1918 and 1921. Uh, Therefore, I have a strong understanding of how authoritarian governments come to power and the purges they conduct when in power, because that'd be the best way of thinking these what's going on with the federal government and their so-called immigration uh, enforcement is really can be comparable to a purge. So, how the U.S. got to the inflection point of the past few weeks in Minnesota actually follows both the Nazi and the Bolshevik playbook of abusing their citizens fairly closely, although at a much faster pace than those brutal regimes. Unlike in 1920s Russia and 1930s Germany, it is the speed of operations in today's United States that is an outlier. Russia's abuse of its citizens did not start ramping up until 1927, which was 9.5, 10 years after the uh, spring and October revolutions of 1917, after the Russian Civil War of 1918 1921, which ensured that the Bolsheviks were the ruling power. There was also the messiness of Stalin's sudden death in 1924, and so it took a little while for Stalin to consolidate power. And so while they were starting to persecute their enemies a little bit under Lenin and early Stalin, it really was only after Stalin consolidated power under his command in 1927 that the purges began. Like the past year, Stalin's abuse did start against ethnic minority farm workers, specifically the Cossacks and Ukraine, and expanded from there. An entire system of prison camps was also established in regions where the Soviet planners had major projects that needed to be built or in major industrial areas. Thus, these prisons, better known as gulags, provided free labor to the Soviets, and those in prison would be pushed to work until they died or were lucky enough to reach their release dates. Star Wars fans, please think of the Narkita uh, prison camp system. You saw it in the first season of Andor, so it's kind of like that, just not as high tech. Likewise, the Germans were doing the same thing as the Empire and the Soviet Union after they gained control of the Reichstag and had Hitler installed as chancellor. They began to round up their political enemies, especially the communists, and sent them to their first concentration camp at Dachau. As the Nazis continued to consolidate their power, they expanded their dragnet to all political opponents that were still in Germany, uh, ethnic gypsies, the LGBTQ plus community, and ultimately Jews. Again, like the Soviets, the concentration camps provided free labor for the projects that Hitler used to revive the German economy, and prisoners were also lent to factories, farms, and mice to provide workers at a fee, which is what Oskar Schindler did in as portrayed excellently in Spielberg's masterpiece Schindler's List. Both Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany denied due process to their political enemies and undesirable people. Both states used violence to capture their opponents. Both regimes imprisoned their captives in inhumane conditions with poor food, inadequate access to medical care, and improper clothing for the climate the gulag or camp was in. Both regimes would deny the prisoners access to legal help in their families. Families were forcibly separated, with women and prepubescent children in one camp and teenage boys and men in another camp. As a quick note, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau were a few of the exceptions in the Nazi prison camp system, in which there were facilities for women, men, women, and children all at the same location, although still segregated. Most of the Nazi camps are actually small and housed either gender exclusively, much like the Soviet gulags. I mention all this comparative history not to justify what happened nor to excuse what the Trump administration is doing, but rather to remind what unchecked power and a desire to remove certain peoples from a society looks like. What the Trump administration is doing with ICE and the CBP is parallel to Stalin's purges and forced industrialization of the 1920s and 30s and Hitler's genocide of the Jews during the 1930s and 40s. Between these two tyrants, by the end of the Second World War, nearly 30 million Russians and Europeans were systematically murdered in these state-sanctioned programs. And now I will say that is an estimate. No one knows the exact numbers, but 30 million, from what I've seen between Stalin's system and Hitler's system, is most likely a median number, and I tend to go with median numbers because not necessarily to downplay how horrific it could have potentially been, but also not to underplay the numbers. And that's just the number that seems to average out to be the median is around 30 million unfortunate souls were lost during that time. Now, historians like me do not like it when folks say that history always repeats itself, because that actually indicates to us that the individual doesn't understand the past and how to apply it to today. I also don't like the term unprecedented when we're talking about things that are going on, because there's always a precedent in the past. However, history does rhyme. And by that, I mean that while history does feel cyclical at times, it truly isn't. But we still find ourselves with similarities with past events and can adapt lessons from the past to guide us today. Saying that, while this is happening, what is happening with the brutality ICE and CPB against suspected undocumented immigrants is very similar to what the Cheka, the secret police in Russia, and the Gestapo in Germany were doing, conducting mass arrests of targeted groups. And the governing system and the American societal norms are actually completely different than those of Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. Unlike the United States, with this year celebrating 250 years of independent democracy guided by the citizenry, Hitler came to power after 14 years of attempted democratic governance in the Weimar Republic, with Germany being an empire and separate kingdoms before that. Soviet Russia actually only had 6 months of very weak democracy after the Romanov dynasty collapsed and before the Bolsheviks seized power. Thus, there was not any time for democratic traditions and norms to be established before authoritarianism took hold in those two countries, unlike the United States today, where we can take our ability to guide the government for granted. Furthermore, the Nazis and Bolsheviks quickly eliminated any political opponents within the first few years of their regimes, the latter having devolved into an all-out civil war. This has not happened with the Trump administration. There is still an opposition party that controls 49% of both chambers of Congress. And there are also dissenters in the president's own party that still hold a seat on Capitol Hill. Finally, unlike Trump's America, the Nazis and Bolsheviks, as part of their consolidation of power, purged their entire judiciary systems and appointed new judges that would answer to the party leader. In the United States today, judges, while appointed by the president, after they are confirmed by the Senate, are in their roles for life or until they decide to retire or get promoted to another bench. The American judiciary is protected from a mass purge of judges because the Constitution gives Congress the power to remove a judge, not the president. Additionally, a judge's lifetime appointment was designed to maintain the independence of the judiciary, thus allowing them to interpret the law based on their understanding of the Constitution and judicial precedents. While I alluded to this in passing a couple of minutes ago, the United States has a long story and praised tradition of expressing our displeasure at policy that we see as unfair, going back to before the Declaration of Independence was written. In addition to citizens having the right to cast their ballots for who they think is best to lead their societies, we also have a constitutionally guaranteed right to peacefully protest. The Nazis and Bolsheviks came to power on the backs of their fellow countrymen, protesting the corruption of the Weimar Republic and the Romanovs, respectively. What we are seeing as the protesting of a corrupt and inhumane, what we are seeing is the protesting of a corrupt and inhumane Trump administration by the American populace. Unlike 1917 Russia and 1930s Weimar Germany, it's not the moderate politics running the government, it's actually the extremists. This is the final way that history is rhyming today. The political climate we have here in the United States is not akin to that of Tsarist Russia or Weimar Germany in its last days, but of the 1890s. To elaborate on this point, the United States by the end of the second Cleveland administration was controlled by conservatives who had regained prominence after the end of Reconstruction and were bankrolled by the robber barons that controlled the major industries. So we're thinking of titans and families such as the Vanderbilts, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and of course they all banked with J.P. Morgan. For the working and middle classes, wages were stagnant, inflation was uncontrollable due to the lack of a central bank, working conditions were horrendous. I think 12-hour work days, you're only off on Sundays, 4th of July, and Christmas at best. And there was also a general sense that the United States itself could be a better place. What came of that general malaise and a few too many violent busting of strikes by the robber barons was the progressive movement, with its key leaders including William Jennings Bryan for the Democratic Party and Theodore Roosevelt for the Republicans. The first victory for progressives was when William McKinley was elected president in 1896. He correctly read the public's mood and appointed Republican progressives to numerous cabinet and undersecretary positions, including Teddy Roosevelt. So, with all that said, repressive policies and regimes do not last long, especially in a democracy that has a long tradition of citizen participation. There will always be a movement that will force the powers that be out, whether internally or externally. I should say, while I'm not officially affiliated with the No Kings movement, there's going to be another nationwide protest against the Trump administration on March 28th. And you can get more information about where a protest will be near you at nokings.org. If you disagree with these protests, please do not react violently. You can definitely counter protest and peacefully, but violence is not the answer. So just protest. And not just go on protest, make sure you go on and vote on every single election day, and not just the big November ones. And I'll be perfectly honest, the primaries, I find, can be more important than the general election, as that's when each party will have a whole slate of candidates that are trying to represent that party, and they're all over the spectrum. And that's actually the best place where if you want to say there's an incumbent Republican that you think is not doing a good job, but there's another one you think would be better, then that's where you can pick that Republican. Or if you prefer a Democrat and there's one that's more socialist that you want, but the other ones, the more popular ones, are more centrist, go put your voice out there, because your voice will be heard by the candidates that way, because that's a way they figure out what people want. So that's what I got to say on what's going on in Minnesota. Sorry, I did not have time to prepare anything about the Epstein files this week, because as I'm recording this on Friday the 30th, the file release has only been out for a few hours. I was in classroom when that happened, and I just haven't had a chance to completely review it, and I want to make sure I give you a proper explanation of what I found in it, looking to it as a historian and as also someone who served on a uh, criminal jury trial. This jury kind of give you an idea of what kind of evidence I would be looking for to either convict or acquit the suspects. So with that, I'll have something on Epstein next week. And with that, I hope you like this. Please subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone or someone's you think would be interested in a historian's take on what's been happening the past couple of weeks in Minnesota. If you're going to comment, please be kind and respectful. And I will hope to see you next week. And until then, have a wonderful week. Bye bye.